I am excited. I love the Gospel of Mark. I don't know about you guys, but I've really been enjoying reading through this Gospel, preaching through this Gospel, learning through it, being challenged by it, being encouraged by it. And today, we get to continue in Mark chapter 2. So if you have your Bibles with you, I encourage you to open those up, power those on, and go to Mark chapter 2. Today, we're going to be in verses 18 through 22, and I have titled this message, New Life Requires New Living. New life requires new living. In last week's passage, in case you weren't here or in case you need a reminder, we saw Jesus selecting another disciple. His name is Levi or Matthew, depending on which gospel you're reading. And so he selected Levi, who was a tax collector. And in Levi's response to Jesus selecting him as a disciple was complete and utter joy and thankfulness. So in response, Levi was like, you know what? I'm going to put on this huge party and put on this huge feast, and I'm going to invite all my tax collector friends over, and we're gonna have a party. We're gonna celebrate this. And so they did that, and there were some scribes and Pharisees that were outside of the house, outside of the place, and they began, asking questions of like, why is Jesus eating with tax collectors and sinners? Like, he's not supposed to do that. These are terrible people. These are people that rip each other off. These are people that rip us off. And they gouge us with all these taxes and stuff. He shouldn't be doing this. Why is he doing this? And Jesus' response was, look, you Pharisees, teachers of the law, you say that these people are the sickest of them all. And if they're truly the sickest, then they're the ones in most need of a doctor. And I'm the right doctor for them. And so that was our passage and our message from last week, was Jesus in that scene, in that setting. And today, in verses 18 through 22, we come into a situation where we go from Jesus feasting with sinners, how dare he, right? And now today, he is being confronted with a question from people. Mark says just a group of people come and ask him about fasting. And now, what I want to say on the front end of this message, and as we read, this short passage, what I want to say on the front end of this is that what Jesus is going to do in response. So he's going to get asked the question, why are your disciples not fasting? These other disciples of other people are fasting, but yours are not. Why? And so Jesus is going to directly answer the question of why they're not fasting. But then secondarily, he's also going to answer the unasked question and when this question was raised. And what he's going to be addressing is spiritual superiority. Now, some of you maybe have had spiritual superiority as part of your past. Maybe there's elements of it that are present in your life today. Maybe none of those things are true, and maybe it can be a temptation for something for you in the future. So what we're going to see is Jesus addressing that, and hopefully it's going to speak some truth to us. Hopefully it's going to speak some clarity to us, and hopefully it's going to provide some guidance for us in either how to kind of overcome spiritual superiority issues, or how to, maybe you've been on the receiving end of people who have felt spiritually superior, who have communicated that, who have domineered over you in a spiritual or emotional way. Maybe this can help provide you some framework for understanding that experience. And maybe Jesus can speak some health and some restoration and some life into your soul today. And so what I want to say on the front end then is, for any of us who thinks that we are or can become closer to God, or earn more favor with God, or somehow have a better standing with God based on our extreme levels of devotion to Him, I want to let you know that Jesus is not on board with that. I want to let you know that Jesus isn't in favor of that mindset or of that attitude. He wasn't in this story and in this passage, and I'm confident that he still isn't to this day. That is not to say that we can live however we want. That is not to say that God still cares about us living in obedience to his word and to his will, because he does. There are still standards of living that God has expectations of us. Okay? I'm not saying we discard those things, because God still wants us to live a life of faith and faithful activity. But we're going to see this evidenced in our story today. So let's look at the first portion here, at the first verse, really, and we're going to see the question then that gets asked to Jesus. So remember, Jesus is at the house of Levi, a tax collector, having this feast. So at some point in time, we don't know if it's directly connected in the same night as this feast he was having with Levi and Levi's tax collecting buddies, or if it was sometime shortly or long after. But what we see here in verse 18 is it just says, now John's disciples, John the Baptist, John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. And people came and said to him, why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? So this is a question posed to him, and Jesus is going to answer this question in verse 19. But before we get there, I want to talk you through and show you why am I bringing up spiritual superiority here. It's just a simple question, Travis. They're just asking about why are they not fasting? Why don't your disciples fast? Well, what we do know, because these people and because Mark gave us a little bit of information, a little bit of a clue in here about what is going on behind the scenes, what's going on culturally, what's going on that's not being spoken of. He mentioned specifically John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees. So what that's a clue for you and I to know and for us to see is, who was John the Baptist? John the Baptist was a very pious and very devout follower of God, right? He was the messenger who came to prepare Israel for the coming of the Messiah. He lived out in the wilderness. He wore clothing made out of camel's hair. He ate locusts and honey. It wasn't locust the bug, as we talked about in Mark chapter 1. It was the fruit of a tree that could be ground up really kind of into a powder almost. And essentially what John the Baptist was making was, he was making wilderness power bars that were mixed with like honey and almost like a wafer, if you will. And so John lived strictly just on that, a very strict diet. And so John would oftentimes fast, not only from other food that people would eat and this one solitary food item, but he would also, there's other literature that tells us that John would go through like long periods of complete fasting from food and water. And so due to the nature of people during the time and ministry of John the Baptist, they began to follow John. They became disciples of John the Baptist. And we can find later on in the book of Acts and a couple other letters in the New Testament that disciples of John the Baptist exist outside of the nation of Israel. They exist in the northern Mediterranean countries as well. The Apostle Paul, as a matter of fact, he encounters some people who say that they're disciples of John, and they've never even heard of a spirit baptism. They only know about the water baptism ministry of John the Baptist. They've never even heard of a spirit baptism. And so Paul's like, well, let me tell you all about it. And then they get baptized in the Spirit. So we see that there are disciples of John. And so undoubtedly, as a disciple would, a disciple does what the teacher does. A disciple teaches what their teacher teaches. And so undoubtedly, the disciples of John the Baptist were probably very, very strict in their food regimen. They were probably very, very strict also in following fasting rules that were set up probably by John the Baptist. And then also with the Pharisees, we know that the Pharisees would have followed not only sort of ordained or prescribed fasting given by God and spoken of by prophets in the Old Testament, but we also know that from one scripture in particular that Pharisees also did additional fasts, and they were often 2 weeks in length. So we can see in the Old Testament that fasting, it was prescribed really just for one day out of the year, and it was for the Day of Atonement. During a festival is the one day that God said, the people, you as a people, you're going to fast on the Day of Atonement. But also we can see in Zechariah chapter 8, verse 19, that there are 4 additional annual fasts that people can do, that Zechariah talks about there. And then also in Esther chapter 9, there's potentially another fast that is mentioned there in Esther chapter 9 that the nation of Israel, some people, they would say, you know what, this fast happened during Esther's time, let's do this fast as well. But these things weren't necessarily prescribed and ordered by God. They're just, things that God's people did. There are also several references to fasting in the Old Testament, but most of those reflect individual choice rather than a set or prescriptive pattern. Here in Mark, as I mentioned, he notes for us John the Baptist, and that John the Baptist and the Pharisees' disciples, that they were fasting. We can see in what I mentioned just a few moments ago about the habit of Pharisees and their fasting. We can see in Luke chapter 18 a description from the Pharisees. So this is Jesus talking to Pharisees, and Pharisees speaking with Jesus as well. In Luke 18, starting in verse 9, he also told us this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. So Jesus shared this parable starting in verse 10. 2 men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed like this: God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector standing next to me. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing afar off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Let's leave this up here for a second. I wanted to underline these 2 statements, these 2 phrases for a reason. Even though Jesus is telling a story, he's telling a parable here, Jesus most likely didn't make up this number out of thin air. Very likely in his interactions and his relationships with Pharisees, it was sort of a mixed bag of relationship, if you will. Jesus loved the teaching of the Pharisees, but he hated their behavior. Okay, but I fast twice a week. Look at me. I fast twice a week. I tithe on everything I get. I go to church every Sunday. I go to every church event. I help little ladies cross the street. I open doors for people. I tip extra when I go to the restaurant. I do all these. Look at me. And Jesus says, and so I love the contrast Jesus gives. So Jesus identifies pride and arrogance and spiritual superiority by the statement, I fast twice a week and I give all this and I do all that. I love the contrast with, at the bottom, for everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and the one who humbles himself will be exalted. So the silent accusation coming against Jesus in verse 18 of Mark chapter 2 is that Jesus is not taking religious observance seriously enough because there are other groups of people fasting more than his disciples. And as a matter of fact, your disciples are not even fasting at all. Why is that, sir? Now, was Jesus against fasting? He was not against fasting. Certainly not. Matter of fact, Jesus fasted himself. He got baptized. If we remember right, Jesus gets baptized in water. He comes up. God speaks. Wow. And then the Spirit drives him out into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights, fasting and being tempted by the devil. So Jesus fasted himself. So he's not anti-fasting. And then, matter of fact, we'll see in verse 20 as we work along in here. In verse 20, Jesus says, my disciples aren't fasting right now because I'm here, but when I'm gone, they will. A day will come when they will fast, but I'm here right now, so they're not. And we'll talk about that in a few moments. But we see then also in Matthew chapter 16, starting in verse 16, Jesus says, and when you fast, not if, or should you happen to, or because the doctor says, but he says, and when you fast, do not what? Do not look gloomy like the hypocrites. We know who he's talking about, right? The Pharisees. For they disfigure their faces that their fasting may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And some versions will say will reward you openly. So Jesus has the assumption that you and I will fast. And that when we do it, we're not doing it to look better than other people. And we're not doing it to say, oh, woe is me, I'm struggling right now, have pity on me. Which is what Pharisees would try to do as well. Not only, look at me, I'm better than you, I'm fasting more than you, but also, man, I'm suffering, you should feel bad for me, or for us to look upon them in a certain way. So what we can see evidence then by disciples of John the Baptist and disciples of the Pharisees, about them, they must have been doing more than just regular fasting. They must have been doing just more than Day of Atonement fasting or any of these possibly 4 other times that we see in Zechariah that people fasted. It had to have been more along the lines of twice a week. At minimum, twice a week. And so they're wondering, so they're seeing this, why are they fasting that much and you're not? Like, you must not be taking this as serious. So we see this sort of questioning that's also an accusation against Jesus. And we see this happening. So that is, when I talk about spiritual superiority, that is what's reflected in the nature of them asking that question. If Mark would not have mentioned John the Baptist's disciples and disciples of the Pharisees, we could just read on through and just imagine that this is just a normal, genuine, why aren't you fasting? I'm really curious. I just want to know. But it's because these are mentioned, we know it's a tip-off to you and I saying, there's more at play here. They're wondering why you're not as serious, Jesus. Why are you not as spiritual? Why are you not as holy? Why are you not as devout? Why are your disciples so late? You guys are partying, for crying out loud. You're feasting and we're over here starving to death. What's going on? Do you not care about this as much as they do? And what really strikes a chord in this for me is that when I first became a Christian, I went through this process of several months. I was extremely depressed. I was trying to get a job and I couldn't get a job to save my life. Night jobs, day jobs, construction, grocery store, like anything. I couldn't get a job. Was living in Fargo, North Dakota. My roommate and I, we ended up, because I couldn't get work, couldn't pay rent, we got evicted, and I literally had nowhere to go. And there was some friends of mine were traveling from somewhere in Minnesota, and they were going to visit family in my hometown of Devils Lake, North Dakota. So there was this caravan, if you will, that was, and I was like, okay, it's either I'm going to be homeless in Fargo, or I can show up in Devils Lake where I have some friends and I have some family, and I can just show up and hopefully have a place to stay. So I was like, well, Option number 2, it is. I didn't have a phone, didn't have a cell phone. This is early 2000s. We weren't quite hip yet. And I mean, people had cell phones, but I was too poor to have one. And so I just like, hey, do you have an empty seat in your vehicle? I just have a hockey duffel bag of clothes. I won't take up much space, and whatever money I have, I can give to you for gas or whatever. And so they brought me home to Devil's Lake, and a process of probably about 6 months after being there, I just showed up to a cousin's house. When I got dropped off, I was like, hey man, can I stay with you? And his mom was like, yeah, sure, it's fine. And so I stayed in this basement. They gave me an air mattress to sleep on. And when I say a basement, it wasn't like carpeted and finished. It was concrete walls, concrete floor. Some of the walls were crumbling, super musty and dusty and not pleasant down there. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to make the best of it. So I just had a little corner room, had a little tin closet to put some of my stuff in. And that was my space. So I went through this process of about 4 to 6 months probably of, going back to the bar and still partying, doing all this stuff. Well, eventually I was like, I want to give this up and all this. And so eventually I was like, you know what? I'm done with that. I need a change in my life. I'm not going to go out and whatever. So I started reading this book a friend had given me. It was a Left Behind book. Read through that book. And then just one night, Friday, October 3rd, 2003, the presence of God showed up in that room all by myself. My cousin was out partying. It was a Friday night. God showed up, gave my life to Jesus, completely radically transformed me in that moment. Gave up everything that I was doing, went to church that Sunday. And then I met a group of people. I had 3 friends from high school that were at church when I went to church that morning, and they were up in the front raising their hands, and I was like, what? This is wild. None of us were Christians in high school, and here they are. They had been Christians for a little while already, and they're up there doing their thing and getting in it. And so I had built-in friends. I had a couple family members that attended that church, and so I had this built-in family. So I got part of this group of people. There's these 2 older guys that were kind of, I guess, sort of discipling us, if you will. And so we ended up, the four of us ended up hanging out with these two older guys. We trusted them. They were older. They'd been Christians for a long time. So we'd go to prayer meetings at their house, and then we would go to these other like evangelistic meetings that an apostle so-and-so was holding, and we got really into it, and we heard this term like getting drunk in the spirit, and then like all this other stuff. And so we got involved in these meetings and in this ministry. And after a few months of being in that, we began to develop, we didn't realize it in the moment, but we began to develop like this ideology, this thought, this spiritual superiority over everyone else in our church, that we're having these amazing spiritual experiences and no one else is. What are they not doing? Those losers? Do they not care about God? No, I'm telling you, this is what I thought. Man, I'm a new Christian, and they've been a Christian for 20 years. I mean, how lame of them to not know about any of this stuff. Like, they're not praying for 3 hours straight. Like, they're not fasting and praying, and they're not going to these meetings. They're not seeing healings. They're not like getting words of knowledge, and they're not having all these spiritual experiences. Man, I thought I was supposed to be the immature one. They're the immature ones. And I began to elevate myself up above them. And then it all fell apart. I don't have enough time to share stories, but eventually there was this one night I confronted one of these older gentlemen. He was acting very, very like rudely. He hated his daughter-in-law. He had literally in front of me shot his daughter-in-law's dog out on their farm and was happy about it. And like he was doing all this stuff, and I confronted him one night, and he lashed out at me. He almost punched me in front of everybody, and that kind of broke up the whole group. And then I went through this process of trying to figure out what spirituality is. But I read this passage, and when I first like understood this, that when Jesus was talking about spiritual superiority and what that can do to us, it can give us this elevated sense of we're better than others. And if you're not doing what I'm doing, certainly I have a better standing with God. Certainly God hears me more. Certainly God is acting more on my behalf than he is on yours. And so from my experience and from Scripture, I'm just saying that that's not true. So then what? What was Jesus's response to this question? So first of all, he's going to answer the question about fasting directly. And then second of all, because Jesus can see beyond the words and see beyond the question, he can see the heart and the attitude, and he understands the context of what's going on here. He's also going to address spiritual superiority. So we're going to see his response here in verses 19 and 20. So Jesus responds this way. So he says to them, "Can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day." So Jesus gives to them and gives to us basically a 2-verse parable, or even a 1-verse parable, if you will. And he gives them to them an analogy of a wedding. What are weddings like? What do we do at weddings? Yes, it's the coming together of two people to become one family unit, right? But what do we do? Do we come there and show up, and are we gloomy and sad? I mean, maybe some of us are. Maybe the in-laws are, right, or whatever. But we come together to celebrate at a wedding. There's food and catering and dancing, but don't swing your hips. And there's dancing, and it's fun, and there's a little drinking, or maybe a lot of drinking, but we're having fun, right? We're celebrating the new couple and the newness of life and the new journey that they're on and the new family that's been created. And there's this newness and this joy and this celebration. So Jesus uses that on purpose. And he uses the scene of not just a wedding, but him being the groom, as a visual illustration to communicate and to respond directly to this question about fasting and the bigger, broader question of spiritual superiority, by him saying this: there were old ways of doing things, or in his days, there's current ways of doing things, as far as being a follower of God, being a child of God, and being in covenant with God. There's a certain way to live and do things. But in me, there's new ways to do things, and there's new ways to follow God. And the new ways, and we're going to see this here with the two follow-up parables, the new ways are incompatible with the old ways. The old ways are not bad. The old ways are not wrong. The old ways are not evil. They're just now old, and we have something new to replace them. And they can't coexist. We can't mingle them together because it can do damage and can do harm. But so Jesus gives this wedding analogy. And he says, hey, this new life, this new way of doing things, it's a party, man. It's fun. It's a celebration. It's not gloomy and sad and full of fear and doubt and trepidation, but it's filled with joy and happiness and peace. And he's like, that's what we're doing. That's what this is all about. And me, Jesus, I am the source of that joy. I am the source of the celebration. And because this wedding is going on, my disciples, the wedding guests, they're not fasting because I'm with them and we're partying. We're celebrating the new kingdom. That's why they're not fasting. But they will, because eventually I'm going away, and then they're going to want to fast because they long for me. And they're going to want to fast, and at that time it'll be appropriate. But right now, we're not doing it. And then, so Jesus directly addressed the fasting issue. He's like, look, we're having a good time. We're going to continue to have a good time. We're going to continue to eat because it's fun to eat. And we're celebrating the coming of the Messiah. The Messiah is here. We're going to celebrate that. And then Jesus moves on from that to talk about, he's going to give two different parables, two different stories, if you will, about the incompatibility and the destructive results of attempting to try to compromise old ways with new ways. And how if we cling to old ways, that can become spiritual superiority in our lives as well. None of you are that way, but I'm pretty sure that you probably know people who are that way. King James Version only. Hymns are the best. Hymns are great. But there are people that are hymns only. There are people that are translations only. There are people that are, whatever. Pick your poison, I guess, if you will. So Jesus is going to give these two examples to address spiritual superiority. The first one, in verse 21, he says, "No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth to an old garment. If he does, the patch tears away from it, the new from the old, and a worse tear is made." So what's he talking about here? Again, this is the incompatibility of new with old. You have a pair of jeans, or maybe some overalls, or some skiing pants, or whatever. Okay, and let's say they're 10 years old. I have a nice. I have a black Carhartt, right? It's not black anymore. It's kind of mostly grayish. It's faded on the elbows. I have a couple tears and rips on the collar and stuff, so it's like vintage, right? I guess vintage is the right word. So it used to just be practical, but now it's cool. So I went from practical to cool on accident. And I love that jacket. Now that's not gonna, nothing with that jacket's gonna be wrong, but let's say you have a jacket or, a pair of pants or whatever, and you got a hole in it and you want to patch that up. Let's just pretend that holes aren't cool. Rips in jeans aren't cool right now. Let's just pretend for a moment. And you're like, you know what? I want to put a patch on that. Jesus is giving this example of if you're gonna patch your old jeans, you're gonna need to use a patch that comes from old used cloth. If you use a brand new cloth that's not shrunk yet, that's not worked out yet, and you put that patch on there, what's going to happen the next 2 or 3 times you run that thing through the washing machine is that it's going to shrink, because new clothes shrink. I tell Jen all the time, this shirt fit perfectly when I bought it, but for some reason it doesn't fit right now because it shrunk when we washed and dried it. And so what Jesus is saying, you put a new patch on an old piece of clothes, it's going to shrink. And what's going to happen is it's going to pull that old cloth in with it, and it's going to rip it and make it worse than before. Why would Jesus share this kind of example when he's talking about fasting? Because he's not talking about fasting. He's addressing the spiritual superiority, and he's like, look, move on from it. There's a new way. The new way is not like the old way, and we need to move on from it. And then to hammer the point home even more, he gives the second one. And no one, in verse 22, and no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is destroyed, and so are the skins. But new wine is for fresh wineskins. Now, I've never produced wine, but I read up on the production of wine, especially in the first century. So really quick rundown of how wine was produced back then. So they get the grapes, they squash them out, they get the juice, right? And then the grape juice has to go through a fermentation process in order for alcohol to become part of the juice and turn into wine, right? So part of that process is they would take from the crushed grapes, they would filter it out the best they can. There's still material inside of the liquid, but they would take this stuff and they would either put them into vats or barrels, but most often they would use wine skins. They would use skins, and so they would put new wine into a new wine skin. So just think of like a few liter jug of this. They would put it in there, and then they would wait a certain period of time, and any of the material that's in there would settle to the bottom. And as it was settling, gases from the fermentation process would also fill the bag, and it would stretch the bag. The bag would expand from the gas because they would seal it up. The gases would expand the bag. Then once they would look in there and see all the stuff had settled, they're like, okay, time for phase 2. We pour this wine now into an already used wine skin. So they transfer that into a new wine, or into a new wine skin, and they keep transferring the wine into new wine skins so that those skins can continue to expand and the bag doesn't break. If you were to pour new wineskin into an old wineskin, what would happen is you pour that new stuff in there, seal it up. It's in an old wineskin, and the gases from the fermentation process would expand, and that bag is already weakened. That bag is already softened, and what would happen is that bag would burst at one of the seams, and not only would the bag rip, but then all that wine would be on the ground, and then you're out of money and you're out of drink. So Jesus is using that example as well of saying no one does that. No one puts new wine into an old wineskin, because if you do, it's incompatible. It'll be destroyed and it'll be damaged. So why share these two examples when talking about fasting and then talking about spiritual superiority? So Jesus recognized in that question from these group of people that they were looking for him to be, in their eyes, more serious about God. And Jesus, why are you not behaving the way that we always have? Why are you not doing it the way we always have? Why are you not doing it the way these other people are doing it? And their framework for doing life and doing ministry, whether it was biblical or extra biblical, or in certain cases unbiblical, he was addressing their view and their mindset of, you need to do it this certain way. And Jesus saw that and knew of the Pharisees and knew of their disciples and of the disciples of John the Baptist, that they in some ways demanded this higher, deeper, more committed spiritual activity out of their leaders. And Jesus was just simply saying, that's not how this new kingdom works. In this new kingdom, you find your joy, you find your satisfaction, you find your hope, you find your fulfillment, you find your pleasure in God, and God's pleasure in you is found in him. He's saying it's in me. It's not in the things that you do, it's in me. And see, I have this feeling that the people that came and asked Jesus, as well as the disciples of John and the Pharisees, they had this idea that if I fast more, if I pray more, if I go to synagogue more, if I give more, if I do more, then in God's eyes I'll be more. Then in God's eyes, I will earn more because I've done more, and I've sacrificed more, and I've given up more. And Jesus is saying that's not how that works. Because when you give your life to Jesus, you get it all. There's no favor that you can earn from God than the moment you give your life to Jesus. You have it all. When God looks at you, when you give your life to Jesus, when God looks at you, he sees you the same way he sees Jesus. Now, God still wants you to live holy. God still wants you to live according to his word and to his will. God has patience, but God is displeased when we intentionally live a sinful life. But I'm telling you, there's nothing you can do today, Sunday, February 4th, Super Bowl Sunday, whatever it is. 12th already. Holy cow. Look at a calendar, Travis. There's nothing you can do more today or tomorrow or that you can do whenever to earn more trust. Well, maybe to earn trust, to earn more favor and to earn more pleasure from God. You can't. You can get your life right. You can give your life to Jesus, and that will earn you all the favor you need from God and all the pleasure you need from God. Now, fasting is beneficial. Jesus fasted. His disciples fasted. We just got done fasting. Fasting still is a thing where God just is like, hey man, you're fasting, you're giving something up, and God answers prayer. He still hears us in those times. But let me tell you, you can go the rest of your life without fasting 1 second, and you will earn no more or no less favor or approval from God than you have right now as a follower of Jesus. And we should be thankful for that. We should be thankful that we don't have to earn it from him, that he just gives it to us. And so that's the grace of God. That's the hard part maybe of understanding God at times, is that God gives all of himself to us when we give our lives to Jesus. And let me tell you, no matter where you're at in your life right now, maybe you haven't like truly given your life to Jesus yet. Maybe you've never said, you know what, like maybe you grew up in church, maybe you've been doing church for a little while or whatever, but you've never like given your life to Jesus. I encourage you to do that today. If you're trying to work to gain God's approval and you haven't yet given your life to him, man, that you're on a treadmill. You're on a spiritual and maybe even a physical treadmill. Give your life to him and just say, Jesus, my life is yours. And he will transform you here and now. For those of you that are Christians, maybe you've been trying to earn God's favor. Maybe you've been trying to earn God's grace or his mercy, or maybe you've been trying to do good things to make up for bad things that you've done. Look, you don't need to do that. You don't need to make up for mistakes. There's this really cool thing that God does with us. He forgives us. And let me tell you, when God forgives you, he forgives you. He moves on. He doesn't look back and say, well, I forgave you for that thing last time, and here we are again. Let me think about it. He'll do it. So let go. Let go of whatever it is that you're trying to earn from God. And because his grace is sufficient for you in all things, and all the favor and all the mercy and all the grace and all of the Spirit that you could ever want is already available and accessible to you. And if there's any level, any amount of spiritual superiority that you might feel over someone else because you pray more, you go to church more, because you fast more, because you do XYZ, fill in whatever spiritual discipline you want, I want to encourage you, let the Spirit of God speak to you this morning, and to let you know that maybe you might be more educated, maybe you might be more mature, maybe, yes, praying is great, yes, fasting is great, yes, studying and reading the Word is great, and we should all be doing those things. Those are all standard things we ought to be doing. But don't for a second let yourself go any further in thinking that you have better access to God than anyone else does. It almost destroyed me. I almost walked away from Jesus a few different times during that season. Matter of fact, I'm going to end on this, and I'll pray over you. So during that season of like spiritual superiority that I felt over others, and then that world came crashing down, I was sitting in a car with Jen, and we were at a Bible camp in North Dakota. We were working at it, and we were sitting there during a break, and I was telling her, I was like, you know what? I'm so confused, and I don't know what to believe or where to go or what to do with how I used to believe, and now this like new stuff I'm learning, and that some of that stuff was bad and some of it was wrong, and it like messed me up. I was like, I'm just gonna give up. Like, this isn't worth it. I'm not gonna be a Christian anymore. And literally, you guys, in that moment, as I was saying that, my mom's cousin, who, however that relation works with me, I'm not going to try to figure that out. My mom's cousin, who was the worship leader at my home church, he came walking up. Our windows were up. He came walking up to the door next to me. I was a little bit emotional, a little like angry and all that stuff. So I rolled the window down, and you know, like you're having a friendly conversation with a friend or a loved one, right? It's heated, and then you have to transition, and like everything's okay. So I rolled the window down. Notice I rolled the window down. I was like, hey, what's up, Bob? How's it going? He's like, oh, hey, not much. He's like, I'm not interrupting, am I? I was like, no, you're fine. He's like, hey, I have a question for you. We're doing this. There's this big like event going on downtown tomorrow where they block off the streets. All the stores bring all their like stuff out in the street, and you can go shopping in the street, and there's vendors and this whole big week-long thing. He's like, we're doing this outreach, and we're bringing the trailer, and we're having like a worship set, and we're looking for people to share their testimonies. I'm wondering if you'd like to share yours. And I said, Bob, I would like to. And I did. A few days later, I was able to share. But you guys, look, there's no amount of favor you can earn from God. Nothing you can do more to earn it than anyone else. And so let's rest in his grace this morning of that. Okay? Let me pray over you. Father, we thank you so much that you are full of grace and that you're full of truth. We thank you that we have disciplines accessible to us like fasting that we can go to in times when we want you to move, when we need you to move, and when we're desperate. We have things like fasting that we can go to, a tool like that we can go to pray through and to see prayers answered. We thank you for that. And God, I also ask and pray for any of us, maybe we are experiencing spiritual superiority in this place right now. God, I pray that we can humble ourselves so that you don't have to. God, I pray that for those of us that have experienced the back end or the front end of the abuse of spiritual superiority from others, I pray, God, that you help us with a clearer lens to understand that person, to understand that situation, to bring healing into our lives from that situation, to understand that wasn't good, that wasn't profitable to that person, that wasn't good or profitable to me. And God, we want to pray that you can be a revelation to them of their superiority, that you can bring humbling to them, that they can right things that were wronged in their own lives, and God, bring healing and peace into our own life, giving us the confidence and strength to know that we are good enough for where we are at in our relationship with you, that we are not less than and we are not greater than our brother and sister sitting next to us. And for those of us, maybe in the future we're going to get a bug of spiritual superiority. God, I pray that this message, that this scripture, it can be a reminder to us that we have to humble ourselves and will be exalted by you in due time. But I pray this over your people in Jesus' name. Amen and amen. Well, I hope you guys were encouraged, maybe challenged, or blessed by that message today. Reminder, this Saturday, come and hang out with us at Kincaid Park at the Warming Center, or the Outdoor Center, I guess they call it there, for some sledding and for some hot beverages. And yeah, I think we'll probably have our Huskies with us, so if you really like Huskies and want to get hair all over your jacket and gloves, you're more than welcome to come and do that too. But all right, yeah, have a great rest of your Sunday. Happy shoveling, and we'll see you guys Saturday.